Hi, my name is Jim Lee, and I'm an Associate Professor of Asian American Studies here at UCI and the Director of its Center for Medical Humanities. I'm also a priest in the Episcopal Church, and I mention this because today I'm going to share the story of one of my intellectual heroes, a fellow priest, and the former Archbishop of Cape Town in South Africa, the Most Reverend Desmond Tutu. Recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for mobilizing religious communities around the world to fight the racist system of apartheid in South Africa, Bishop Tutu has won global and historic prominence as a key champion for human rights and social equality. For me and for so many others, Bishop Tutu's life exemplifies the virtues of both intellectual tenacity and intellectual humility. Professor Pritchard views these two as particularly and importantly tethered to one another when he says that intellectual humility and intellectual tenacity are not only compatible with each other, but in fact complementary, as indeed are all the virtues. Let me start with intellectual humility by stating categorically what humility is not. Humility is not self-denigration or self-erasure. It is not, as Professor Pritchard puts it, an underinflated sense of self, but a disposition that begins in knowing one's inherent self-worth. This is an important first dimension to recognize as we ponder Bishop Tutu's life, for he was born in 1931 in a society that sought to denigrate and erase the self-worth of Black people in South Africa. While the formal apartheid system that made white supremacy the law of the land wouldn't be established until 1948, the general displacement and dispossession of Black South Africans had already been taking place for generations. But young Desmond's family and community imbued him with a deep sense of self-worth. His father helped him cultivate a love of reading, and his mother taught him compassion for the underdog. So even as he grew up in a world in which the second-class status of Blacks was unquestioned and indeed enforced by the rule of law and the violence of the state, young Desmond secured an integrity of self necessary for him to lean into intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is the precondition to knowledge. As Professor Pritchard puts it, to be intellectually humble is to be aware of one's fallibility and hence to be willing to learn from others and their expertise and experience. Relatedly, it also means being open to new evidence that might be available, so being willing to change one's minds as the evidence changes. Let me offer two moments in Bishop Tutu's life that demonstrates this. When he was visiting his mother, who worked 80 miles away from where he lived, 10-year-old Desmond saw a white man in a black hat and white cassock pause and doff his hat to his mother. "You could have knocked me down with a feather," Tutu recalls. This man was Trevor Huddleston, a monk who would become a mentor to Tutu. For a white man in South Africa to greet a Black woman with honor and respect rather than racist dehumanization was, until that point, beyond Desmond's imagination. And yet this small gesture made an indelible mark and allowed him to imagine a South Africa that could be multiracially equal. 27 years later, during which he was ordained an Anglican priest, studied in London, England, and began teaching theology in South Africa, Tutu delivered a sermon that compared apartheid to the Soviet satellite countries of Eastern Europe, one of his first overtly political homilies. A few weeks later, students at his school protested university administration policies and were met with police, tear gas, and attack dogs. Tutu waded into the group of students being attacked and prayed with them. The next morning, at a chapel service, he wept. Up until this point, the political situation in South Africa certainly impacted Tutu's vocation, but racial justice was not his focus. This event changed him, and he began to develop out of the conditions of injustice a ministry to and for victims of racial violence. In both of these examples, being presented with new information and changing conditions, a white ally in one moment, the intensification of state violence in another, opened Bishop Tutu to imagine differently and act differently. Intellectual humility enables new thought and new life practice. Now on to intellectual tenacity. In every society struggle for civil and human rights, for social equality, there is the temptation to jump to the achievement, the victory, the happy ending. The decades of protest and global boycott finally brought down the apartheid regime and ushered in open elections and a multiracial democracy for South Africa in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela as its president. But don't skimp on the struggle. The struggle, the journey to freedom, and the endurance it took to bring about this new South Africa is itself a marvel to behold. It speaks to the deep tenacity of Black South Africans that they could continue to resist oppression and claim their durable integrity in the worst moments, just as Black people have done in our country for centuries and continue to do so to this day. To have the grit to continue your inquiries, even in the face of obstacles, says Professor Pritchard in describing intellectual tenacity. When Tutu traveled to London to pursue postgraduate studies, he served as an assistant priest in a local parish. There, he was paid only 2/3 of what his white counterparts received. Yet he persisted. When he was installed the Dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg in 1975, he irked the majority white and conservative congregation by pushing for the ordination of women, the use of gender-neutral references to God, and most pointedly, his sermons denouncing what he called the deafening white silence to the state violence perpetrated against South Africa's Black citizens. Yet he persisted. When he was enthroned the first Black bishop of Johannesburg, and later the Archbishop of Cape Town, becoming the first Black leader of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, Archbishop Tutu used his ever-growing platform to deepen and broaden the struggle against apartheid. And this was not only a political struggle for him, but a theological one. In some of the darkest days, when the government effectively banned all Black and other anti-racist organizations from operating, when Black people were dying by state police forces by the hundreds, Archbishop Tutu would give speeches like this. It is important for the Church of God to tell the people of God, hey, 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 our God sees. Our God hears. Our God knows, and our God will come down and deliver us. And we say in South Africa, we say to them, hey, 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 we are going to be free. We are not asking for permission from the rulers of our land. We know we are going to be free. And we say to our oppressors, do you know what? We are being nice to you. We are inviting you to join the winning side. Come and join the winning side because you have already lost. Archbishop Tutu persisted because through his struggle, as an individual expression of the larger struggle for Black liberation in South Africa, he had developed a theological grit a tenacity of faith that justice and freedom would prevail. You and I pursue intellectual tenacity not only for our self-improvement. You and I demonstrate grit because what we do in struggling against obstacles is for the sake of others, for our families, our communities, and perhaps most especially for those made most vulnerable in our society by injustice and oppression. This mutuality of intellectual humility and tenacity is crucial to furthering not just individual intellectual capacity, but society's values. Through his rigor of study and action, through his balance of curiosity, of humility, and determination of tenacity, Archbishop Tutu has continued to push the boundaries of who gets to count, who must still be seen in the church, in society, and in the world. While other Anglican colleagues considered LGBTQ people unworthy of social protection and care, listen to what Tutu said when asked about whether LGBTQ persons should be fully welcomed in the church. He said, "I would refuse to go to a homophobic heaven. No, I would rather say sorry. I would much rather go to the other place. I would not worship a God who is homophobic, and that is how I deeply feel about this. The Jesus I worship is not likely to collaborate with those who vilify and persecute an already oppressed minority." Likewise, for you and me, intellectual curiosity and tenacity can lead us to ask over and over, who's not yet in the room? Whose voice, whose story haven't we heard yet? One more dimension about intellectual humility and one more story about Archbishop Tutu, probably my favorite. There's a reason why humility and humor are so interconnected. At the most basic level, humor reminds us that the work may be serious, but one need not take oneself so seriously. After he retired as Archbishop of Cape Town, Bishop Tutu would often vacation in the bucolic hills of Santa Barbara. He was also famous for his love of gin and tonic. One summer, upon arriving in Santa Barbara, he went to the local grocery store to buy his beloved beverages. At the checkout counter, a woman looked at Tutu, then at the bottles on the conveyor belt, moving toward the cashier, then back at Tutu, then back at the bottles. She paused and looked at Tutu again and said, "You know, you look like that Desmond Tutu fellow." "My dear woman," Tutu replied without hesitation, "I get mistaken for that scoundrel all the time. The work you embark on is serious, but you don't need to be. So this year, have fun, take care, stay safe, and be well."